Hello and welcome to our final episode on the Gospels. Jim, it's great to see you. How have you been keeping?
I've been keeping very well, thanks. I've been preparing myself mentally for the inordinate amount of socialising that goes on round about Christmas. I mean, I am very happy to be in the company of people, at least I am, when everyone in the room knows why they're there. You know, if there's some clearly understood objective for the gathering. But at Christmas time, one gets invited to a party just to have fun, and I find that confusing and stressful because it's a ridiculous objective.
Jim, I don't believe that you don't enjoy a bit of fun from time to time. In fact, you were just telling me about an event you organised a number of years ago here at the church. It was a sort of a murder mystery night, and you played Gregorian chants. That sounded like a lot of fun.
The mystery of the Grey Monk. It was actually such a dark plot that I really embarrassed myself in front of the elders at the time.
Man, I would love to give that murder mystery night a go. But yes, I do know what you mean about talking to strangers, to be fair, because, you know, the small talk can be quite awkward. I do get that.
Yeah. I had I don't know whether I should tell you this, but I had a truly traumatic encounter with a stranger yesterday.
I would love to hear about that.
So I don't want to embarrass anyone, so I'll not describe the specific context, okay? But I fell into conversation with a woman in the course of what you might call a normal transaction that all of us have in daily life. And I had made some harmless jest about the inefficiency of the local council. And she sniffed loudly and said, "It's all part of their plan." Now, I'm not sure my local council is capable of having a plan, any plan, nefarious or otherwise. I mean, they struggle to empty my bin. So anyway, I should have really slowly backed towards the door. But I chose to mumble some diplomatic, non-committal reply. And unfortunately, she took that as a sign that I shared her conspiratorial worldview. So before long, I found myself really in the middle of a Dan Brown novel. I mean, I learned, you may not know this, but I learned that the word smart in a smartphone stands for self-monitoring and reporting. Did you know that?
I didn't know that. That's news to me.
Yeah. Well, anyway, there's quite a lot of truth in that, I guess, but the conversation then took a decidedly darker turn. I was warned never to take my car to an MOT centre.
Oh, and you literally just have done that as well.
Yes. And she also told me that she never paid car tax. Wow. I mean, the reasons for that strategy eluded me, I have to say. But the problem was I was trapped in this. I was just reduced to vague, mumbling replies that only served to make things worse. And by the end, I found myself nodding in agreement at her suggestion that we should each own a shotgun with which to shoot down government drones.
Wow.
So the lesson is clear, Ollie. Never talk to strangers.
Oh, dear, Jim. Okay, well, I do understand why, that particular conversation didn't go well, but don't let that put you off, Jim. There's plenty of more normal strangers out there who I'm sure would love to chat to you this Christmas, and I'll be praying you encounter them. Anyway, moving swiftly on. In this season, we've been talking about the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And for the past 250 years, the Gospels have been a battleground. Critical scholars have done their best to portray the Gospels as fictions invented by the early church to serve political purposes. So we thought about the three quests to find the authentic Jesus. But it became clear, as we progressed through those quests, that every critical scholar's attempt to divide the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith ended up creating a Jesus in the image of the critical scholar himself. These critics looked down into the well of history, and ultimately all they saw was a reflection of themselves. Then we discussed the idea that the Gospels do not give us access to what Jesus actually said. Critics argue that the Gospel writers just give us a gist of what Jesus said. So we are listening to Jesus filtered through the personalities and theological convictions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Jim, that conversation was surprising in a way because many evangelicals seem to have gone along with that idea. Why was that? Just remind us.
I think it's because of the topic we're actually going to discuss in this episode, the accusation that the Gospels contain a lot of contradictions. And one easy way to answer the charge of textual variance in the sayings of Jesus is to use the idea of ipsissima vox rather than ipsissima verba. In other words, just the gist of what Jesus said. It's a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card whenever an apparent contradiction is raised. But I think it comes at too great a cost. And as we are going to see today, there are more persuasive ways to handle the apparent contradictions in the Gospels. Now, just before we get into that segment of the discussion, Ollie, I just want to wrap up the argument against the critics who try to portray the Gospels as the invention of the early church. And the argument is really simple. These 4 documents changed the world. They led to the rise of Western civilization. The teaching of Jesus is incredibly profound and novel, but it is also accessible to everyone. His parables explain deep things in a way that anyone can understand. So whatever else we think about Christianity, there must be, at the back of it, the mind of a genius. I've just finished Peter Williams' new book called The Surprising Genius of Jesus, and it's basically an exposition of the parable of the prodigal son. But he shows that whoever invented the parables was a genius whose mind was saturated in the Old Testament. And he goes on to show that the parables are constructed in a similar fashion, often opening with a question, having the same closing structure. And that structure and the use of common motifs applies across Matthew and Luke. So we can't attribute the genius to either of them. There seems to be a single figure, someone with towering intellect and genius communication skills, standing behind all the parables and sayings of Jesus. And the history of the world testifies to the truth of that statement. So it's irritating when some nonentity from the Jesus Seminary with a third-rate brain tries to argue that the sayings of Jesus are the invention of a politically motivated scribe in the early church. Because the inference to the best explanation is that the sayings of Jesus were said by Jesus.
Jim, I sense you are getting frustrated there towards the end, so we'll move on quickly from that topic. Let's turn to the questions of contradictions between the Gospels. I think this is a really significant area of discussion, particularly for young Christians. Before we get into specifics, though, we need to understand how critical scholars think the Gospels came about. I guess the best place to start here is to ask, in what order were the Gospels actually written?
Well, I remain agnostic about whether Mark or Matthew came first. As at a minimum, I think we can say Matthew is much earlier than most people suggest. And then Luke wrote his gospel after Mark and Matthew. Now, I'm going to just vent for one more moment here, Ollie, about the schoolboy level arguments that critical scholars put forward for a late date for Matthew. So, in Luke chapter 11, the Lord Jesus is accused of driving out demons using the power of Beelzebub. And in reply, in Luke's gospel, he says, "If by God's finger I cast out demons, then God's kingdom has come upon you." But in Matthew's account, Jesus says, "If by God's Spirit I cast out demons." Aha, says the critical scholar. God's finger is a more anthropomorphic statement, a more primitive statement about God. So Luke is obviously the more primitive form. Therefore, Matthew must be dated later than Luke. That is puerile stuff. Obviously, Matthew and Luke have selected phrases from a longer reply given by Jesus, because he's making 2 separate points. The term finger of God is an allusion to the plagues of the Exodus, when the magicians tell Pharaoh that the plagues are the finger of God. So in Luke, the point is that God is more powerful than the forces of evil. But the Lord also wants to contrast the uncleanness of Beelzebub with the holiness of the Spirit of God, and that is the point Matthew selects to make. So there is no credible reason to dispute the claim that Mark and Matthew come first, and then Luke, and finally John.
Okay, that's helpful. The early church believed that Matthew was written first, then Mark, followed by Luke, and then John. And that's why the Gospels are arranged like that in our Bibles today, isn't it? But the most popular theory today is that Mark was written first. This is the theory called the two-source theory. Can you explain how that works?
The two sources theory postulates that Luke and Matthew had access to Mark and one other source document. They call it Q. And it is said to have been written at the same time as Mark. And then, says the theory, Matthew and Luke were written using Mark and Q as their source material. That's why it is called the two-source hypothesis, with Mark and Q being the two sources.
Is there any evidence for the existence of this Q document?
None. Not a scintilla of evidence. But that hasn't stopped critical scholars from publishing it. I talked in an earlier episode about techniques called source criticism and form criticism. So scholars have used these techniques to create a version of this imaginary document Q. And then some of them used form criticism to show how Q evolved. And lo and behold, a scholar called Mack discovered that Q came from a different Jesus tradition, one which distances itself from his atoning death and his claims of deity. I mean, you just couldn't make this stuff up. is beyond parody, layer upon layer of speculation. I mean, can you think how an academic would be treated if he invented an entirely fictional source document for Virgil's Aeneid and then proved that his fictional document had originated from an earlier fictional tradition? It's risible.
This discussion about the ordering of the four Gospels matters because there are clear literary links between them. When you place Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, anyone will be struck by the similarities in wording, content, and order of the material. But at the same time, you will notice divergences in exact wording, content, and order. There are big blocks of teaching in Matthew that are not present at all in Mark, and which seem to be scattered throughout Luke. A complete map of the material shows that the content and order of Mark is almost completely followed by Luke and Matthew. About half of Jesus' teachings in Matthew are also found in Luke, and Matthew and Luke each have a lot of material that is unique to each Gospel. Those statistics might lead some people to say that the Gospel writers copied each other's work. Is that something a conservative Christian could accept?
Well, in principle, we should be delighted at the idea that the Gospel writers had access to written records of Jesus' teaching and his works. At the start of his Gospel, Luke says this: "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word." So I have no problem in principle with the idea that the Gospel writers might have had access to sources written earlier. However, that is not to accept the critical idea that the Gospel writers copied from each other. Each of them could have had access to accounts written by eyewitnesses, including the other apostles. So when we encounter a similar but not identical literary unit in two different Gospels, we should not say that A copied B and did a pretty bad job of it. A more likely explanation is that A and B had access to other source material which contained the superset of what was said, and then each made their literary selection.
So what we're establishing here is a defense against all the accusations of apparent contradictions. If we discover a variant between Matthew and Luke, for example, then it does not follow that Matthew contradicts Luke. Each Gospel writer has selected a portion of his source material for his own literary and theological purposes.
That's right. So, anyhow, I guess it's time we started to talk about some specific contradictions. I gave a talk on this a couple of years ago, and I didn't want to be accused of choosing my own examples. So I found an atheist website called infidels.org, which was promoting what they called their top 7 Bible contradictions. So I suggest, Ollie, we use their list first, and then we can deal with some potentially more difficult ones.
Okay, that sounds like a good idea. So the first example on their list was about Jesus' trial. Did Jesus answer his accusers? The atheist website claims that Matthew says Jesus didn't say a word, but that John's Gospel shows him speaking to Pilate. So which is it?
Yeah. Well, in Matthew 27, verse 14, we see Pilate marveling because the Lord Jesus refuses to defend himself against the accusations made by the Jewish rulers. But step back to verse 12 of Matthew 27, and you'll hear Jesus speaking to Pilate. So Matthew does not say that Jesus never spoke a word throughout his entire trial. He chose not to defend himself at a time when the Jewish rulers were haranguing him. And later on, he chose not to speak to Herod. But there isn't the slightest contradiction between John's account and Matthew's account.
Okay, let's move on to the next one then. What colour was Jesus' robe? In Matthew's account, the robe that the soldiers placed on Jesus is described as scarlet. But in the accounts of Mark and John, it's described as purple. Is that not a contradiction?
Wow, that objection was clearly raised by an interior designer. I mean, if you consult the archaeologists in this point, you find that a particular shellfish, a mussel found along the Mediterranean coast, was used to create the dye in question. And the colour is described by the experts, and I'm quoting here, as reddish purple. You've also got to remember that the cloak would almost certainly have been old and stained. So I would argue that difference of perspective is evidence of eyewitness testimony. I mean, what exactly are the atheist critics expecting here? A specific RGB color code?
That's a fair point. Okay, let's move on to the next contradiction, or supposed contradiction. Who carried the cross? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we read that Simon of Cyrene carried the cross, but in John's Gospel, we're told Jesus carried his own cross.
Well, first of all, let's notice that both accounts show incredible familiarity with Roman customs. It was custom for a criminal to carry his own cross. But a Roman centurion also had the right to command any Jew to carry a burden for up to a mile. Now we also know that the Lord Jesus had been so severely beaten that he died much sooner than expected. So a reasonable harmonization would see Jesus carrying his own cross, but perhaps as the procession leaves the city gates, the Lord is so weakened that he stumbles, and at this point the centurion orders a Jew coming in from the countryside with his family to carry the cross. Now, I can't prove that events unfolded in that way, but I don't really need to. It's a completely plausible scenario, so it defeats the charge of an unreconcilable contradiction.
Okay then, what about what was written above the cross? According to Matthew, the inscription read, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." In Mark's record, it is "the King of the Jews." And Luke records it as "This is the King of the Jews." And then finally in John, it is "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
Well, I imagine everyone listening has already solved this one. The full text probably read, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The first clause identified the criminal, the second the crime. I actually see more evidence of eyewitness testimony here. John quotes the entire content of the inscription because he stood right under the cross, but other eyewitnesses might only have seen the crime statement. The point for us is that there's no contradiction between the accounts.
What about where the women were during the crucifixion? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that a group of women stood afar off, quite a distance from the cross. But then in John's account, we have women standing at the foot of the cross, close enough to hear Jesus speak to his mother. Is that not a contradiction?
Well, the gospel writers are really specific when talking about these women, because they're named. And in fact, we discover there are two groups of women. The women from Galilee stand afar off. That's women like Salome and John's biological mother. But Mary, the mother of the Lord, and her sister stand at the foot of the cross. And there's only one woman who's in both lists, and that's Mary Magdalene. But the crucial point here is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the position of the women at the exact moments of Jesus' death. Okay, John's interest in the women is before the Lord dies. So I think it plausible that Mary Magdalene had joined the Lord's mother to comfort her, but had left the scene and rejoined the other women as Christ died.
Let's move on to the next supposed contradiction. Did one or both of the criminals revile Jesus? According to Matthew, both criminals insulted and reviled Jesus, but in Luke's account, only one does. Is that not a contradiction?
Well, remember, Luke is telling us the story of a conversion. The dying thief, as we know him, went to Golgotha as an unbeliever. He and his mate directed their anger and pain onto Christ for a while. But you remember, 3 hours is a long time, and imminent death caused one of the criminals to think deeply about his life and about the man dying beside him. So he converts to faith in Christ. So once again, there's no contradiction. Both men started off reviling Christ, but one of them got gloriously saved just before he died. It is a psychologically compelling explanation.
Atheists would place a lot of emphasis on the apparent contradictions found in the accounts of the resurrection. Bart Ehrman says that the resurrection accounts contain contradictions that cannot be harmonized. And on the infidels.org site, we're asked who visited the tomb first. Matthew tells us it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark adds in the name of Salome. Luke lists out Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and another woman. And John says it was just Mary Magdalene.
There's a Bible scholar called John Wenham, and he's written a really compelling harmonization of the Easter story. It's called The Easter Enigma. You have to remember that the garden of the tomb was very close to the city. It was about a 10-minute walk. And when you put all the pieces of the jigsaw together, I think you get this utterly authentic picture of confused people running back and forward from the city to the garden tomb. And there's also a great deal of angelic activity, just as there was during the Lord's birth. But to answer your specific question, we might consider a scenario like this. Mary Magdalene had been staying in Bethany on the Saturday evening, and while it was dark, she and Clopas' wife walked to John's house in Jerusalem to pick up Salome, and they then maybe used the Geneth gate to get to the garden. But there's a fascinating little detail in Luke's account about Joanna, because we're told that she was wealthy. She and her friend Susanna could have been staying in the richer part of town, perhaps, the Hasmonean Palace or somewhere. Now, if that was the case, they would have used the Ephraim gate to leave the city very early in the morning. And so the two groups of women could have arrived at much the same time.
So those were the top 7 contradictions on infidels.org a year or so ago. But contradictions are also raised by serious scholars like Bart Ehrman, and he raises the question of Judas's death. There are two accounts of Judas's death, and in Matthew we're told that Judas hanged himself. In Acts, written by Luke, we're told that he fell headlong and his body split open.
About a year ago, I remember watching Peter Williams debate Bart Ehrman. The event was facilitated by Justin Brierley. And I was watching it while I was making a supremely unhealthy meal in my kitchen. And at one point, Ehrman is challenged to give his best shot to deliver the knockout punch to biblical inerrancy. And he chose the story of Judas' death. I remember spinning around from my aga, holding a fish slice in my hand, saying, "Judas, really? Is that your best shot?" Because to understand the story of Judas' death, you need to appreciate two pieces of information. And the first is about the terrain of the area where Judas died. It's a place now known infamously as the Field of Blood, because Judas was its legal owner. The 30 pieces of silver had bought him this grotesque inheritance under Jewish law. And it's not a parcel of land. In fact, there's lots of ravines and valleys and so on. And a good number of the trees grow on the edges of the ravines. So that's the first piece of information. The second piece relates to Luke's literary goals in the book of Acts. He deliberately contrasts Judas's grisly, horrible end with the picture of the ascended Christ, who lives in the brightness of heavenly glory, in the power of an endless life. So let's put those together. What actually happened to Judas? Well, he committed suicide by hanging himself on a tree. I think he chose one of the trees that grew on the edge of a ravine. And he hung there for weeks, perhaps. No one buried him. They just left him to enjoy the view of his inheritance. And eventually, the rope broke, causing his rotted body to fall, and he then pitched headlong down the ravine, and his inward parts spilled out. Now, it is a completely grotesque story, of course, but it fits perfectly with Luke's literary goals. So what Ehrman calls a contradiction turns out to be a piece of literary genius. Now, that harmonization is plausible, so it defeats the charge of an unreconcilable contradiction.
It's coming up to Christmas time, Jim, so let's take a couple of apparent contradictions from the story of Jesus' birth. Luke states that the census decreed by Augustus was the first one taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. However, Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until after the death of Herod in about AD 6. So is this an error then in Luke's historical record?
I would regard this apparent contradiction as much more serious than some of the other ones we've talked about so far. But there is some archaeological evidence that Quirinius was governor of Syria on two separate occasions. Once between 12 to 2 BC, and then later beginning about AD 6. And the evidence comes from a coin. A Latin inscription was discovered on it in 1764, and it seems to refer to Quirinius as having served as governor of Syria on two occasions. Now, that's just one possible answer. Conservative scholars have proposed a number of other ones as well, but it is a serious accusation, yeah.
But not one that is insurmountable.
No.
Atheist websites are fond of accusing Luke's genealogy of Jesus to also completely contradict Matthew's genealogy. How could Matthew's list be so different from Luke's?
The traditional answer given by Christians is that Luke records the Lord's humanity through Mary, while Matthew records the generation through Joseph's line. But that leaves an obvious problem, because in verse 23 of Luke, we find Joseph's name in Luke's genealogy. So we ask ourselves, what is going on? Well, some really early extra-biblical sources tell us the name of Mary's father. The so-called Palestinian Talmud records Mary's father's name as Eli. Now, Mary, we know, had a sister, but we have no evidence that she had any brothers, and that would have meant that Eli's family name would have died out. And I don't need to tell you that the ending of a family line was regarded with horror in the ancient world. Just read the book of Ruth if you don't believe me. And so it was very common for a man in that situation to adopt a younger man into his family. And I'm not just talking about biblical practice here. The Romans did this sort of thing all the time to keep the family name from being lost. And so it's entirely plausible that Eli established his future son-in-law Joseph as his heir. It's actually really not all that different from a woman in our culture taking on her husband's name. Now, one of the reasons I'm attracted to that explanation is that in the original language, Luke deliberately doesn't use the word son. In every case but one, the Greek says, man X was of man Y, in the sense that X was Y's heir. And in the case where he does use the word son, Luke uses it dismissively when he says that Jesus was the son, as was supposed, of Joseph. So he's clearly not so much interested in biology and the passing on of DNA as he is of being a member of the human race. That's why at the very end he can describe Adam as the son of God. Now, God didn't reproduce Adam, he created him. But Adam was an heir of God. So I think the church's traditional solution is right. Luke records the Lord's genealogy through Mary, while Matthew traces it back through Joseph.
Thank you, Jim. That's a really helpful whistle-stop tour through some of the supposed contradictions. I guess I'll just finish on a slightly more pastoral note. How should we react as Christians when we encounter an apparent contradiction that seems to maybe intimidate us a little bit?
Well, remember, of course, you're not the first person to encounter these apparent contradictions. A lot of people have walked this path before, so there's a lot of really good material out there. Norman Geisler's The Big Book of Bible Difficulties is a very good resource to have. In general, I would say, sometimes in life we just need to be patient until all the facts come in. So we've talked before in terms of the doctrine of inerrancy, which I define as saying, when all the facts are in, it will be clear that there is no contradiction between the Bible and history or the Bible and science. So if you take the example of Quirinius, for example, I just think that not all the facts are in. So more work by archaeologists and historians will eventually show that the Bible's record is not wrong. And so sometimes we just have to reserve judgment until more facts come in.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I wish you a very happy Christmas along with all of our listeners. Thanks for sticking with us this year. What's written on your list for Santa this year, Jim?
All I want for Christmas is a shotgun to bring down government drones.
On that happy and strange note, we'll end. We'll be back after Christmas. We're hoping to do an Equip Live episode at one of the universities here in Belfast, so we look forward to that, and we'll hopefully release that as one of our podcast episodes. And yes, I'm sure there'll be plenty of new topics as well in the year ahead, Jim, as we continue to address big issues that are relevant to the Christian faith. But for now, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year from the Equip Project podcast, and we'll see you again, God willing, in 2024.